كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to this 10th session of the WISE BA course delivered by White Thread. So we are going to try to continue with the discussion of illah today, and in this case the discussion today is very important difference we need to provide first before we carry on to some of the other aspects of illah. So today we're gonna discuss, inshallah, the difference between illah, which means the effective cause, and the wisdom behind the legislation of something. That's very important because a lot of people confuse the two. Then we're going to discuss the difference between illah and a sabab and a shart and an alama, and I'll define these properly just so that you understand that we should not mix these up. And then inshallah we're going to discuss mawani'ul illah, hindrances to the illah. So we finally identified the illah, and we found that it seems to qualify, it seems to be effective, it seems to be in line and congruent with other illah found in the Sharia directly. Okay, so great, let it produce the hukm. No, it can't produce the hukm. So there are mawani, which means that there are obstacles in that path of allowing the illah to work. So while it's supposed to be effective, there's an external, so sometimes it's not effective intrinsically due to something in itself, but now we're talking about extrinsic reasons that create a block. So the illah is raring to go, it wants to do its thing, but then there's a block, there's a prevention, there's a hindrance. So inshallah we're gonna discuss that. So let's start off first with a discussion on the difference between illah and hikmah, or the wisdom behind something, and how that should not be convoluted, that should be not confused with one another, because the illah is what affects the cause, is the effective cause that affects the hukm and provides the hukm. The wisdom doesn't do that. So the hukm cannot revolve around the wisdom of it, and a lot of people confuse between those two things. So we want to, essentially, you can say illah is the effective cause. We already defined that. So what we're going to be doing now is defining the hikmah, so that you can see the difference between them, inshallah. So let's define the hikmah. The hikmah is that benefit which the Sharia is trying to gain. It's actually the benefit that it's trying to attain through the hukm that has been legislated. So essentially that is the inspirational factor rather than the effective cause. It is the maslaha, right? It is a reasoning. It's not the cause though, right? Which it's a reasoning, it's a benefit, it's a wisdom that the Sharia wants from this. For example, it could be trying to benefit the practitioner, trying to benefit the human being in a certain way. That could be perspective, or it could also be that by legislating this hukm through that effective cause, the Sharia wants to protect a person from harm. So it's either trying to bring him some benefit, or try to protect him from some harm, or trying to at least minimize the harm and reduce the harm, or trying to even augment a benefit. It's already a benefit, but doing this additional hukm, this additional act, and making it necessary or making it mustahab or something, is going to give you a more completing, more perfection in that regard. So let's a very simple one in that regard. An example of that is the impermissibility, the unlawfulness of drinking wine. Okay, and the impermissibility or the unlawfulness of drinking wine is the hukm, that it's not allowed, right? That's the direct effect of it, right? The fact that it is called khamr, and it is khamr, right, which is, as I defined earlier, that is the illah. So because the Prophet ﷺ had made it very clear, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it very clear that khamr is what's haram. So anything called khamr, and that defined as khamr, that is the illah for making that thing haram, right? Now, one of the wisdoms of that is to protect the human being, right, from doing crazy things, from losing their mind. That's a wisdom of it. That is not the cause of it. I know a lot of people think the cause here is this, but the Hanafis have looked at this as the khamr being the point and the side point being the wisdom, right? Now, you could consider the fact of intoxication in another way. That's a different issue, but it's going to be unrelated. It's not going to be related to khamr here. So, the unlawfulness of something, the absolute unlawfulness of something is going to revolve around its illah, which is it is being a khamr, right? So wherever khamr is found, whether in a small amount, large amount, it's going to be the case. We're not going to necessarily call everything that intoxicates absolutely unlawful and haram. Yes, we could call it makruh, tahrimi, impermissible and so on, but there's a difference between those two factors, right? And we'll understand a bit more about that when we go into the chapter on ahkam, right? On the different types of hukam and what's the difference between a fard and a wajib, and what's the difference between a haram and a makruh tahrimi. Although they both have to be avoided, they're both impermissible, but there's actually a difference between them. So this is talking about, strictly speaking, calling something haram haram as opposed to makruh tahrimi or prohibitively reprehensible or disliked. So the hukam is not going to revolve around something being intoxicating, because that's or something causing you to lose your mind. That is a wisdom of it. That's not going to give the same hukam as what the khamr gives. It could give another hukam, but that's not the point here. So that also means, on the flip side of it, if somebody drinks khamr, loads of wine or champagne, for example, and he only gets drunk after 2 bottles of it, which is crazy, but just as a hypothesis. And he says, I'm going to drink 1.7 bottles, I'm going to drink 1 bottle, and I'm going to drink 3/4 of the other because I know I'm not going to get intoxicated. So it should be halal for me. No, because it is khamr that you're drinking, so even a drop of it is haram. The hukam here does not revolve around its intoxicating factor or that it's going to mess up your mind. If that was the case, then people would be allowed to drink to less than that amount of wine, and that's not allowed, right? No madhab allows that. Now you can see the benefit of this, or how this really plays out. You may have not been able to see the benefit of it earlier when he said, okay, not every intoxicating thing, if it's not khamr, we can't call it haram. Yes, we can call it something else, but we can't call it haram, right? Strictly speaking. But you see the benefit now that it's not going to be left to a person's tolerance level. It's haram, haram, haram. That's it. It's gone, right? Likewise, another simple example, because I think it's a very common example, I think I need to mention it, is that the shortening of prayers when a person travels, right? Now, why should travel provide dispensation in the number of rakats of prayer? Well, one of the wisdoms there is that it's because there's a difficulty usually associated in traveling, and difficulty and removal of difficulty, as we've seen from some of the examples previously, is a intended benefit in the Sharia. However, that is seen here as not the illah. The illah is not seen as removal of difficulty. That is its wisdom. That's its wisdom. So the illat of it is the journey, that it be a certain distance, 48 miles for example, as the ulama, before it used to be 3 days journey. Now today, because 3 days you can go around the world, so it's been reduced to how long it would have taken to get to do a 3-day journey in those days, which is about 48 miles. So that is what its illah is going to be. So anytime now you go on a journey that's over 48 miles over, khalas, you can shorten the prayers. Even if it's a first class limousine chauffeured journey where it's actually better than being at home in a sense, makes no difference. It makes no difference, because a lot of the journeys today don't have that same kind of difficulty that were associated before anyway. So mashaqqa, or removal of difficulty, is actually just the wisdom here. It's an output, it's an outcome, it's a purpose, it's a side benefit or an ultimate benefit, but it's not the effective cause. So now I think that makes it very clear that the hikmah, it doesn't revolve around the wisdom, it revolves around the illah. Sometimes you can more easily see the wisdom in something rather than the effective cause in something. So it's more difficult sometimes to determine, like in these two cases, you would have thought, you would be forgiven for thinking that the difficulty in the travel, and in the first case the intoxicating aspect is what is the illah, but it's not. It's actually the wisdom. And the fuqaha, the jurists, have looked at this very detailed because if we just took what we initially thought, then we would run into other trouble, like I explained about a person then wanting to drink until he gets to his tolerance level, right? Okay, so that's very clear. Now what we move into is the discussion regarding some other, or the differences rather, regarding some other terms that you will come across that are related and how they affect one another. So something very close to the, again, just to define what the effective cause, which is called the illah in Arabic, is the factor, the effective factor to provide the hukum. So they're concomitant. Usually anytime that you have, unless there's a prevention, external prevention, right? But intrinsically speaking, it should provide the hukum, so they're almost like concomitant, okay? Now you also have other factors, right, that facilitate for that hukum to take place, but they're not effective causes of it. So for that is what you call a sabab. A sabab is a non-effective cause. It's a facilitating factor. It's a means of some sort. But having the means does not create the effect. So having the means to pay zakat does not mean that zakat is paid. Okay? Having money does not mean you're going to pay zakat. Having a car doesn't mean that you're going to pray, right? Or that you're going to go to the masjid, for example. The time being there for to do something doesn't mean that that thing will then take place. Whereas when the illah is there, unless it's got an external prevention, it's just going to happen. It's gonna take place, right? So then, so that's a sabab, is ma yusilu ila shay'in min ghayri ta'thirin fihi. It's something which facilitates your path to something without creating direct effect in that thing, without propelling you to that thing, but it facilitates it, and you probably need it for that thing to happen, but it's not going to force you to do that thing. For example, the path to reach the store that you want to go to, or to reach your dad's house. Just the fact that you need to take the path to get there, but the path being there doesn't take you there. You still have to go, right? So the path is there, but you don't travel, you don't take it, you don't bother going. So then it's a facilitating factor. It's needed, otherwise you can't get there, because you need a path to get there, whether through air or through land, but it's not going to take you there by force, right? So you've got a well, or you've got a tap, but if you don't want to open the tap and take a cup and then take the water, you're not going to get the water, even though it's there, right? Okay, there's a third idea which is called the shart of the condition. So I'm going to come to your house if you invite me, otherwise I'm not. So I'm only going to come to your house if you invite me. If you invite me is an external aspect, it's an added condition. That's a condition. I think that one is very simple to understand, right? That you can see is not the cause. So while somebody might say, because you invited me, I'm coming, again, it's a condition that facilitated me coming. It does not force me to come. You could have invited me, I can still refuse to come. Whereas the illah, if that happens, it's going to have the effect, right? Another example of condition is, another definition is ma la yatimmu shay'u illa bihi, that you can't expect the thing to be completed unless the condition is completed. So condition has to occur for the thing to occur. But it is actually the difference between the sabab and that is that it's actually got nothing to do with the absolute essence of that thing. It's always an external aspect. The wudu is a condition for salat. Now, does wudu feature as an intrinsic aspect of the salat? Does it make up the element of salat? No, it doesn't, because salat is standing up and doing some qira'ah and so on and so forth. Wudu is a prerequisite. It's something external to it. So it's a condition. You can have wudu and you don't pray, right? But you can't pray without wudu. So it is a condition. It's so closely related, right? And the sabab would be something more intrinsically linked, but not effective. Whereas the shart is something that is linked, but externally. And then, of course, the mani, the hindrance, is something where you've got the illah, but it's preventing and is blocking the hukm from coming about. A simple example was usually being a close kin to somebody who's died is the effective cause of you receiving inheritance from them. Like being a son, being a father, being a mother. These are all, the son, the daughter, the mother, the father, they always receive inheritance. But despite the fact that it's the illah, there's an extrinsic aspect which could block it, which is one of the hindrances. So that is, let's just say that particular individual killed that person who just died. That would become an invalidating factor, a hindrance to it, even though nothing could have stopped it. So now, why do we need to know this? There's one more thing before we move on. There's one more thing. There's a alama, right? Now, sometimes you have something which facilitates your path to something, but so even a sign will facilitate your path. So a signpost saying your mom's house is that way, you can see how that's actually different, and that's more further removed and distant from the fact of the path which you have to take, right? Without the path you can't go to your mum, right? But the path doesn't force you to go to your mum's house. But a sign is something more arbitrary, more distant, but it is connected in a sense, right? So if, again, just to summarize, the illah is something which is the effective cause. If it's a cause but not effective cause, just a facilitating factor, that's a sabab. Sometimes it's a point which is a condition, then that's obviously a shart and a condition. And if it's something just merely indicates towards it without being a facilitating factor, as in intrinsically facilitating factor, then that's what you call just a sign to something, right? The sign to something. So hopefully that's clear. Now there is one thing, and you'll see as we carry on with this discussion, that sometimes the sabab does stand in place of the illah, right? And I'll explain when that's the case. Sometimes the sabab, which is not supposed to be the effective cause, sometimes acts like the effective cause. It takes on the capacity of an effective cause. So one has to be cognizant of that fact as well, and we'll explain that in the details. Now, when does that happen? So let's look at that in a bit more detail. If usually you're going to have a sabab with the illah, right? In a particular case, you're going to have a sabab, you're going to have a illah, effective cause and the facilitating factor, right? In that case, when you have both, the hukm has to be obviously directly related to and attributed to the cause, not to the sabab. And we know that, right? Because that is the effective inside. For example, let's just say that somebody indicated to somebody, right, that that guy's got a lot of money and he hides it there, right? He hides it in this place. Now, what have you done? You facilitated, in a sense. The guy didn't know he has money there, and you facilitated, I know where he keeps his money. He goes and then steals it. So what was the effective cause of the stealing? That was the theft by that person. You weren't involved directly in that theft. You were indirectly involved by signposting. Could you be held liable for that? So strictly speaking, at that level, you could have a side punishment, but you're not liable for paying that person's money back. He can't charge you for it, even though you said it, because you're not the illah. You're the sabab, you're the facilitating factor. And whenever you have a facilitating factor and an illah, right, then they can charge that the actual thief himself, because he is the effective cause, so he can be charged for it. Okay. Now there could be other lower levels of penalty, some kind of other disciplinary procedure, whatever. That would be a different idea, though, right? Just to make it a bit more holistic. But strictly speaking, that's what it is. Okay, that one is simple. Number two, sometimes the sabab is going to be acting like a illah. Okay, what does that mean? You do have the illah, but the sabab itself acts like the illah. It actually takes on the form of an illah. Has the same substance as the illah. This is when the illah is only facilitated by the sabab. So then in that case, you have to then attribute the ruling, the ultimate consequence, to that sabab, and not the illah itself. Now I know this is sounds very theoretical, but always these things are better with, I've seen in usul, always it's better with an example, right? And then it makes complete sense. That's the interesting thing about it. And that's what I found with usul. You have to do it a few times for you to just get it straight away, because it's all of these different abstract categories, and until you don't start understanding how it works, it's difficult to fathom them and conceive them. But anyway, in that case, what actually happens is that sabab actually becomes the illah of the illah, in a sense, right? In other words, it becomes the illah of the illah. So then, rather going to the illah, the attribution, it goes to the sabab, because the sabab was the cause of the illah, and the illah was the cause of that. Okay. It's a similar example to the previous one, but it's a bit more removed. Somebody drives a beast, right? He's got his beast, and he drives it, and as he's taking his oxen or bulls or cows around, the cow or the bull or the oxen goes and tramples over something and harms somebody's property. Who is going to be liable? In the case of the indicating to somebody where somebody keeps their valuables for theft purposes, the indicator, the person who signposted away, was not directly liable, was he? Right? In this case, can we make the animal liable? Or are we going to make the human liable, who is in the same case as the previous person who signposted? Right? Okay, here it's his animals, he's driving them. Or it doesn't have to be his animals, he's signposting them. Right? So he is actually liable in this case. He is the sabab, he's the facilitator. The illah, the actual cause of it, was the animal, but he is the facilitator. So why do we now, instead of attributing to the animal, why do we take it to the person in this case, the driver? Well, because the driver was the cause of the animal going there and then doing what it did. And you can't charge the animal, because the animal is irrational dumb, in that sense. So they explain this as لأن الحيوان لأن الدابة لا اختيار لها. It doesn't have its own choice, it just does things as it comes, in its way, right? Especially when it's got its driver with it, the driver should be directing it in a particular direction. So that means that driver now, who's actually the sabab, just the facilitating factor, not the effective cause, because he didn't trample. He actually, his animal that he was driving trampled it, whether he caused it or not, but he should have been more careful. So that's why the hukm now is not going to be liability for the animal, but liability for the person driving the animal. So I think that makes perfect sense now, once you understand through the example, that it's where the sabab takes on the meaning of the illah and takes the position of an illah, and then it becomes attributed to it. Okay, this one is very similar to that one, just slightly different. قد يقام السبب مقام العلة. Sometimes so in the case that we just studied, that was where the illah was there and the sabab was there, but we just bypassed the illah for the attribution. This one is where we literally put the sabab in place of the illah, and we replace the illah in a sense. When do we do that? We do that when it's very difficult to determine the illah. You can't identify what the illah is. And when you can't do it, and this isn't an arbitrary process, this is a very particular process, so you can't just say, I don't get this, so I'm going to put the sabab in its place. I have to put something as the effective cause, something has to have liability, something has to have the attribution, right? It doesn't have to be liability cases all the time, right? This is just to make matters easy. For example, a totally different example. The cause of breaking when we say we can't determine the illah, that doesn't mean that we don't know what the illah is. We just can't see whether it was effective there or not, whether it existed there or not. We know what it is, but we don't know whether it exists at that point or not, right? For example, the nullifier of the fast is to nullifier of your wudu is to, for example, pass some gas, for example, right? Among the other ones, passing gas. Now, when a person sleeps, if he's in a light form of sleep, he could probably have semi-control over himself and knows whether he passed gas or not. But if he's in heavy sleep, lying down, knocked out, complete sleep, then would he know if he passed some gas or not? He wouldn't know. So while we know that the illah for nullification of the prayer, nullification of the wudu, is a release of gas. But in this context, there's a likelihood, but we don't know for sure. So we're going to put the sabab, and the sabab of why we don't know is because he's asleep. Why he doesn't know is because he's asleep, he's unconscious, right? So we're going to say, okay, anytime you're unconscious like that, where you can't tell whether you released any gas or not, we're going to make that the illah. So we're going to remove the illah there, right, of releasing wind, and we're going to put the fact that you're sleeping in that particular deep sleep method, deep sleep way and form, and that's going to break your fast regardless of whether you actually did pass any wind or not. That's where you actually replace the illah with the sabab and make that the illah. There's other examples of that. For example, we could say that, when a person gets married, and if they don't consummate with their wife and they divorce, he only has to pay her half the mahar and she has to know iddah. However, if they have had intimacy of being in a room alone with nobody there, or being in a place alone with nobody there, where they could have done what they wanted, but even if they didn't, that will stand in place of it, stand in place of actual intimacy. Now, I know you might say, well, there's nothing hidden here. The actual intimacy and khalwa, and so on, is very easy to determine. But no, they've said that this is a case where most likely you're too close together. So we're just going to we're just going to consider that this is khalwa, and then there's going to be different ahkam related to this based on that, as though you have been intimate, even though you have not been. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4 is sometimes, forget the illah right now, the sabab, we're not discussing the illah now, the illah is there, but the sabab, the facilitating factor, because the facilitating factor has to be there as well for the illah to provide its effect. Now, sometimes the sabab is something other than the sabab is going to be considered the sabab this time. Forget the illah in this context, but something other than the sabab is treated like the sabab, metaphorically speaking. So that is not the sabab, that is not the facilitating factor, but it's seen as the facilitating factor in some cases. So then we would, because remember, for certain ahkam they have to have the sabab. The illah is what causes the hukm to happen, but the facilitating factor has to be there, otherwise the illah can't work. So you usually need the sabab. So you need the path for you to actually get to your mum's house, but the path is not going to take you there. So sometimes something else is considered to be the sabab, right? For example, if you take an oath, and you break it, right? The breaking of the oath is the sabab for which would necessitate you paying an expiation and paying a penalty. However, there are a number of cases where you take an oath. Well, actually, we don't have to say that. What we're going to say is that in this case, rather than breaking the oath, the kafara becomes necessary. It doesn't become necessary unless you break the oath, but in some cases, you have to pay the kafara so that you could do that. So for example, wallahi, I'm not going to speak to my mother. Right? You took that oath, it's a bad oath, you should be speaking to her, so break it and pay the kafara. So in that case, what they actually say, right, is that the fact that you took the oath, that is what facilitated you to break the oath and then to pay the kafara. So the oath itself is sometimes going to be treated, even though that's not the sabab, right? I mean, it definitely looks like a sabab, to be honest. It's going to be treated like the sabab itself, right? So that's where the something else is treated like the sabab. Now, if this is a bit confusing to you, there's a added element which I'll explain now that will make us understand why this is this example works for this point, where it's being borrowed, where this is being treated as a sabab in a borrowed sense, even though it's actually not a sabab, because the oath, right? It is being termed as a sabab for the expiation, even though the real sabab there is the breaking of the oath, not the oath itself. Okay, so why can't this be in one of the other categories where it's the cause of something because he took the oath, that made the sabab, well, it doesn't make it necessary to break it. So that's why there's that difference in there. Whereas in the case of the guy who drove that animal, he is the direct case there. Right? He drove that animal, and that's when that thing happened. So here, a sabab cannot be a sabab if it inhibits the existence of its effect, the musabbab. So because a sabab has to have a musabbab with it, and here, because it does not necessitate the kafara directly, it actually necessitates it through the breaking. There's no way an oath will necessitate a kafara. It has to be broken to effect it. Even if you take an oath that I'm going to pay the kafara, well, it can't be a kafara until you break it. Okay, so breaking it is actually the effect. So however, in this case, they've taken the sabab to be the oath itself, not the breaking of the oath. So yeah, let's look at something else now. What is the facilitating factor for the obligation of prayer? A prayer cannot be considered obligatory, like for example Dhuhr time right now cannot be considered obligatory unless it's the time for Dhuhr. So in the morning there was no obligation for Dhuhr because the time wasn't there, so the facilitating factor wasn't there. Now it's a facilitating factor because even though the time comes in, it does not mean that my prayer is going to come into existence. I still have to do it. Okay, so likewise, the sabab, the facilitating factor for the obligation of fasting, right, is the entry of the month of Ramadan, the hilal of the month of Ramadan. Just because that enters, though, that doesn't mean that I will fast and the fast will come into existence. That's going to be caused by, that's going to be that what I do. That's going to depend on when I do it. Likewise, another example is zakat, right? The sabab for the obligation of zakat, right? I mean, I know we have the ruling to say atu zakah, aqimu salah, and sumu, which is the actually effective cause of making that happen. But the facilitating factor for zakat is that you own a certain minimum amount of money or assets, which is called a nisab, the quantum, right? And with certain conditions and so on. Okay, Hajj, the sabab of Hajj is that there's a Kaaba there, right? There's the Baytullah, and it's a place for it. If that wasn't there, where would you do Hajj? But that doesn't obligate you to do it. The obligating factor, the illah, is something else. And then so on and so forth, right? So now you understand what sabab is. Likewise, the sabab of the necessity of wudu. What is the sabab for wudu now? Meaning, when wudu becomes wajib, what is the sabab of that? Some say it's the prayer. The prayer has made the sabab necessary, because otherwise you don't have to do wudu if there's no prayer time. Others say that no. So sometimes you could actually have what this is trying to highlight is that sometimes you could actually have a difference of opinion as to what exactly is the sabab, because there's many related things. So the sabab for the obligation of wudu, is it the salat, or is it the fact that you don't have wudu and you broke your wudu? So which one is it? So it could be, there's two opinions about that. Okay. The obligation of prayer is a condition, and so سبب وجوب الوضوء الصلاة عند البعض والحدث عند آخرين ووجوب الصلاة شرط. So while that's a facilitating factor, the salat being wajib is a condition, right? And وسبب وجود الغسل الحيض والنفاس والجنابة. Now, وسبب وجوب الغسل, sorry. What is the sabab and facilitating factor for wudu becoming wajib? Not wudu, sorry, ghusl becoming wajib, ritual bath. Well, in that case, I think they all agree it's haid, a menstruation, or postnatal bleeding. You can't have both at once, it's one or the other. Or, if it's none of those, then it's janaba, which means to be in a seminally defiled state. So to discuss and finalize actually the discussion today, I want to just bring in one last point, which is mawani al-illah. So these are the impediments, hindrances, obstacles to the illah functioning that I described earlier, and there are 4 of those, right? Because they 4 of those in the sense of as to where they come into play, where they stand to create the obstacle. So one of the hindrances is the one that يمنع انعقاد العلة. It actually, you can say, desensitizes, or you can say removes the efficacy of the illah. Okay, so the illah doesn't even work anymore, even though it sounds like a illah, etc. So for example, بيع الحر والميتة والدم, right? That means selling of a human being, selling of a free person, selling of a carrion is not allowed, or blood is not allowed, because these are not seen as wealth. So it's gonna, usually even if you think that's your property, you're not allowed to sell it, right? So it's the effective cause of the sale is being neutralized, which is that it's no longer wealth. Number 2 is so the illah is effective, but it doesn't allow it to be completed. It doesn't allow it to complete its effectiveness. So it's not as neutralized as the first one. For example, we mentioned earlier that if you have a certain amount of money or assets, right, and then your year starts ticking from there, and if in the coming year on that same Islamic date you still have that money, then zakat is necessary on you. So while it had started already, and the sabab and everything was there, but if you lost all of that wealth in the middle of the year, you'd go on by 6 months, 9 months even, or 10 or 11, and then you lost all that wealth, it disappeared, stolen, or whatever the case is, or you spent it for that matter, then now this is an obstacle to the illah that was there to make zakat wajib on you, has been neutralized now. So it was active all of this time, and if you hadn't gotten to 12 months, then it would have done its part and you would have had to pay zakat, but it's been stopped, right? Because you no longer have, there's a hindrance, there's an obstacle that's coming, so you no longer have the money to pay zakat on. So there is no zakat now, because zakat only actually becomes effected after the year. Number 3, مانع يمنع ابتداء الحكم. Now this one is a bit different in the sense that it's not completely neutralized, but it doesn't allow the hukm to even take off, right? The first one was that it just neutralized it completely. This one doesn't neutralize it, but it doesn't allow it to take off. It doesn't allow it to become active. For example, again, examples are the best in this case. You sell something to somebody, and when we sell something and the offer and acceptance are done, then it means that the ownership of that has transferred to the other person, even if I haven't given it to him yet. However, if I sell something and there is an option to cancel, a money back option, that okay, I'll give you 3 days or 5 days or whatever it is, or just say 3 days, and you can bring it back or you can cancel the transaction. Now, while everything is in place, all of the building blocks are in place, and the effect is the effect of it and the illat of it, the effective cause of it, which is the ijab and qabul, is ready to go and is done. But because there's that money back guarantee, it's not allowing it to complete. So now we're gonna have to wait 3 days, and if it gets if the option to bring back a return is not exercised, then it's going to be completed, right? So you see, that was stopping it for 3 days or whatever it is, right? Because there was a 3-day money back guarantee. And if he does cancel it, then obviously that means he stopped it. So he didn't allow it to be completed. He didn't allow the illah to have its effect. Number 4 is it doesn't hinder it in that sense, but what it does is that it doesn't allow the effect of it to remain permanent, right? So it stops the illah effect from being permanent. So it does allow it to be effected, and it's there for a while, but then it stops. So it doesn't allow it to continue, even though it should have continued forever, because that's standard. This is, for example, let's just say that and this is a bit of a, hypothetical example, though it could have been a reality before, is that somebody got their daughter married off to somebody, like it happened during time of the Sahaba as well, and then as soon as that girl becomes baligh and mature, she now actually gets an option to cancel that marriage out. Yeah, she has that autonomy to cancel the marriage as soon as she becomes baligh, as soon as she becomes mature. So you see, the effect had already taken place, they were considered to be married, etc., etc., but now a marriage is never supposed to cancel itself, but this is the one time where it doesn't cancel itself, she has to cancel it, right? This is the case when the woman can even cancel it in that sense. So it hasn't allowed the hukm of the illah to remain forever. So there you go, that discusses a lot of the aspects of illah, and I hope that becomes clear. As you can see, there's multi-faceted way to deal with this, and there's so many details in this regard. Assalamu alaikum, keep us in your du'as, barakallahu feekum.